On December 7, 2001, a news article on the BBC boasted, "Lost City Found Beneath Cuban Waters." This exciting news came from a team of explorers headed by Pauline Zalitsky, a marine engineer, and her husband, Paul Weinswig. Their company worked side by side with the Cuban government to try to uncover hundreds of treasure-laden ships from the Spanish colonial era. But what they uncovered using their advanced sonar equipment was far more mysterious.
Pauline Zalitsky was leaking information about what those discoveries were revealing. According to Zalitsky's reports, she was using a submersible and saw that there were sphinxes down there, that there were bizarre inscriptions on the stones. And remember, we're dealing with something that could not possibly have been above sea level for at least 11,000 years. She had submersible footage of a pyramid down there that has kind of a change in its slope angle as it goes halfway up, similar to the bent pyramid of Dashur in Egypt. So we're seeing a direct relationship between these monuments and what we see in Egypt. That to me is astonishing because it suggests that the Egyptian pyramids as well may have been built at the same time and are therefore far older than the assumptions of conventional archaeology. There it is right down there. It's very obviously artificial, and then the whole story somehow got suppressed.
Zalitsky estimated that it would have taken over 11,000 years for such a structure to have sunken to the depth at which these structures were said to be found. Strangely, after they released their findings, the news outlets and networks went dark. What might they have stumbled upon? If this structure underneath the ocean floor sank possibly 11,000 years or more ago, could this be a link to the infamous Atlantis?
Atlantis is almost a catch-all term for trying to find the origins of civilization itself. This probably goes back to the 19th century when the US congressman by the name of Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book that was to become the seminal work on Atlantis. It was entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And in here, what he proposed was that all of the civilizations of the ancient world and the New World, the Americas, had a mother civilization as its source. All of the information that's been left to us on Atlantis by Plato, the Greek philosopher who wrote around 350 BC, suggests that we should be looking for Atlantis somewhere in the area of the Bahamas and the Caribbean. But because of Ignatius Donnelly's ideas to do with a mother civilization, Atlantis therefore becomes this concept more than an actual drowned city. I believe that Atlantis existed. I believe that a high culture probably peopled those massive islands of the Bahamas and the Caribbean, and they may well have been drowned and destroyed in the Great Cataclysm, the so-called Younger Dryas event.
Some experts, like Jack Carey, have done some alternative research that might coincide with the science behind the Younger Dryas.
As far as the sunken pyramids go in the oceans of the world, a lot of that can be tied to research being done by Dr. Courtney Brown and his group of very skilled remote viewers. And they're beginning to not only target what they described as being Atlantis, but through their remote viewings, they're beginning to ascertain that it was this very science that caused the downfall of the society, that they used it in such a way that it literally caused a destruction of the landmass, and that may have actually been part of some sort of conflict or war that was going on. The fact that there's just so many of them all around the world is what's fascinating. Humanity is not come together in any way, shape, or form the way we would want or hope or expect or love for it to do ever since the Tower of Babel, ever since we were spread all over the earth.
A conflict? What kind of conflict could Dr. Courtney Brown and his researchers be picking up on? Ancient texts from the Greek philosopher Plato explain in great detail the destruction of Atlantis by Zeus as payback for human arrogance. The legend describes the founder of the great city to be half god and half human and ruled by Poseidon. As punishment for their immoral bankruptcy, Zeus sent a ball of fire to destroy the aquatic cities. The curator of the Joseph Campbell collection draws some parallels from Plato's story and a similar tale between two warring Sumerian gods.
It is very possible that the Greek story, the one we find in Plato about a lost continent, Atlantis, ruled over by Poseidon, the god of the oceans, that this has earlier roots. After all, storytellers in those times borrowed from other stories, and we can follow. It's called syncretic, the way information, images, and narratives move from one culture to another, particularly if they're relatively geographically close by, which in this case is true. Sure, Enki, the great god of the Sumerian traditions, could have been the Poseidon figure, and the destroyer god could have come from the Sumerian tradition. This is not only possible, it is likely. Zeus is the name we are familiar with from the Greek tradition that comes and punishes the people of Atlantis who have achieved so much because they started taking it for granted.
What could the people of Atlantis have taken for granted? How could they have become immorally bankrupt? Could this be another interpretation of a god figure striking down upon humans for knowing too much?
I think it is interesting because we thought for a long time that Plato had been taught by Egyptian priests. But thanks to the Edfu text, we wonder if he actually had the copies in hand. We will never know. But there are very similar elements between the Plato version of the Atlantis and the Egyptian Edfu text of Atlantis I translated. And we can understand, in a few words, that Osiris, who is considered to be the Sumerian god Enki, fled Mesopotamia to help start a new civilization. According to the doctrine of Enlil, and he flees to Atlantis and settles down on some islands in the Atlantic Ocean. This ancient territory is mentioned in some funerary texts, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They call it La Mata, which can be roughly translated by the water crown of Ta. Ta is one of Osiris's names. It is the Egyptian name for Enki. Like all the other gods, he had many different names. We understand that Ta settles on some islands, and we can identify similar data to that of Plato's writings. In the Edfu versions of the Atlantis, there are always attacks from the forces of Set. Set is, of course, Enlil. We understand that he went all the way to Egypt, even all the way to Morocco, Azores, and the Canary Islands. Set doesn't stop attacking Osiris's islands. Another interesting element to this story, there is a technology that Egyptian gods used for protection, the Djed pillars. They place them around the city. Apparently, some are even on the water. The texts call them floaters. They can protect the city, and we can understand in parts of the text that thanks to the energy coming from these Djed pillars, Egyptians can control water and create water walls, very thick ones, in order to protect the city. Many mythologies and legends have similarities. We understand that Osiris could actually be Poseidon or Neptune, and Enlil, in some ways, could be Zeus.
What is interesting to note is Poseidon is always pictured with a pitchfork that was later connected with the biblical pitchfork of Satan by the Catholic Church. If Enki is connected to this interpretation, could the destruction of Atlantis be the story of Yahweh's wrath on advanced humanity?
In the Edfu text that I translated, they mention the fall of the Eye of Sound. Let me explain. In my opinion, Venus was located close to Mulgae. It was one of its satellites, and when Mulgae exploded, its satellite, Venus, is ejected into the solar system, and at some point, it comes very close to Earth. Then there's Osiris's death. According to the text, this was the work of Enlil, who prepared his attack, both on Earth and in the sky. He really wanted to make history and impact significantly the gods' history. He was not going to be defeated by earthly technology. Venus was ejected into the solar system, turned inside it for thousands of years, before eventually placing itself where it is today. Enlil must have really wanted to finally put an end to the lengthy war he was waging against Inky Osiris. And he came close with the death of Osiris.
Que lorsqu'Isis décide de faire revenir Osiris dans un nouveau corps qui sera le corps d'Horus, dans la Grande Pyramide.
But then a second event, the story tells us, and luckily for history in general, Osiris comes back as Horus and the battle can start again. There are many elements that explain these events and that describe how Horus arrives to destroy the evil of the world in order to avenge his father's death. This explains a similar catastrophic event that happened at the same time, such as the destruction of Atlantis. This arrival is most likely a comet, who is actually Horus, according to Sumerian text. And this is also when the so-called flood happened, about 10,000 years ago.
Let's talk about Lemuria, Frank. We're dealing with two distinctive different locations, Lemuria, Atlantis, and we'll talk about Atlantis in our next program. What is Lemuria, and why do they call it Lemuria? What does that mean?
Great question, George. And Lemuria, what it really means is it goes with the word mu, which actually means mother, or motherland in this case. And it's actually the motherland of civilization. It's where civilization really began, not in Mesopotamia or Samaria, but actually in the area of, in this case, what we found out to be the Southeast Asia, in and around the area of Indonesia. And there's actually, there was not only just the original civilization that actually got destroyed by a cataclysmic event, in this case the Toba volcano, but they also rebuilt. And what they had to do is they had to go find a place after it was basically destroyed by in large part by the Toba volcano into India. And so they had to go there to basically regather, regroup, and really rebuild the other Atlantis. And just so you know, the fatherland of civilization is India. It's more like Pakistan at this time, where the border was in around the Indus Valley area civilization.
How big do you think Lemuria might have been?
You mean in
terms of size?
In size? It was like really continental size. It was, probably actually bigger than Atlantis itself. And Atlantis is at least at the size of the continental United States.
Wow.
With Alaska and Hawaii combined.
Huge.
It's huge land area.
Okay, so with Lemuria, approximately when did something happen to it? And I'm going to ask you to speculate on the people who were on that island. I mean, what kind of technology did they have? I mean, because I've always heard, since I was a little boy, that the technology of these places was absolutely unbelievable. Years and years ahead of maybe even what we have today. So, first of all, when did it go down? Did it sink? Did it just explode? What happened to it?
Okay. Approximately 74 to 75,000 years ago, the supervolcano Toba did go off, and that decimated and destroyed a lot of the area. As far as sinking, maybe not so much in this case as maybe Atlantis, and actually it never did sink. That's an optical illusion.
Okay.
It's really that sea levels rose. And maybe we can talk more about
it. Didn't go down?
No.
The waters went up.
The waters went up.
But could this have been the flood of Noah?
Yes, this has a lot to do with the flood. And what you have is you have the great deluge which came in, and that's just the initial flood. But that, again, it recedes. And it's an optical illusion. So if you're out in a vessel and you take a look at it, it looks like, in this case, maybe a Lemuria that sank, a Lemuria Atlantis, or Atlantis. But it really didn't. It's the sea levels rose. And then later on, and I'll have to talk to you more about this in another program, there is also a universal flood that took place over a period of time as well. So there's really a couple different types of floods, and that's what ended up confusing people.
I have always heard that if you're in a ship during a tsunami, nothing happens to you, because it's kind of like this wave, this push. But if we're talking about something that's 1.5 miles or 2 miles high, that's going to wipe out everything, isn't it?
And it pretty much did. It pretty much started to wipe out civilization, maybe more so with Atlantis proper than it did with Lemurian, but basically about the same thing. There wasn't that a large a population on Earth. The Lemurians, by the way, were not as advanced, because this is your question too, were not as advanced as Atlantis proper. They were leading up to that direction, but then, and they were probably been around for, several 100,000 years, if not 1 million years. And they may have even come from elsewhere as well. But, they weren't quite advanced. And before they got really advanced, they got destroyed, wiped out. And so they had to rebuild. But the key is they had to rebuild. They had a time to rebuild over a period of 60,000 years, because they used their base over in India in order to do that and reassemble it back to Atlantis proper.
Frank, did any of them have time to escape this deluge?
Great question, George. They did, and as I meant, they went originally over in India, but they went to other parts of India to begin with. They got chased out by some of the locals over there, but they ended up settling into that Indus Valley area. Now, later on, they went into some other areas, and they also were a worldwide empire anyhow, even with Lemurian Atlantis. But you got to understand, they had to be constrained a lot of times to that area, because it's the middle of the Pleistocene Ice Age. This was going on.
Everything was happening to these poor people at the time. If they had ships that were out, way, way out, those people would have been okay. When they came back in those ships, what would they have seen? Their land would have been underwater because of the rising sea levels, which I assume was pretty fast too, right?
Yes, and with Lemurian Atlantis, it probably had to do even more so with the destruction there, with a lot of fly ash going up into the atmosphere, and also a lot of vaporized water going up there too. So this ended up darkening out the skies for a while too, not only in that area, but probably even worldwide. The other thing is too, I know it's in a lot of these religious texts and whatnot, it talks about having 40 days of rain and so on. That relates back to what's going on with Lemurian Atlantis. And so that's what all went up into the atmosphere, the stratosphere. And so it came down over a period of time, the 40 days, because all the vaporized water from the super volcano all went up in the atmosphere, darkened up the skies, also the fly ash the same way. And this caused a big problem where it started to cause a possible extinction of the human species even.
When the waters recessed, the land kind of showed again, right?
Yes, that's after the initial deluges that take place. What tsunami
was left after the waters receded? Nothing, everything was obliterated?
Well, what happened is that some of the land appeared again, of course, and some of the people went up to the upper, altitudes of the islands, or the continent of Lemurian Atlantis, Mu, but some of them had to disperse into other areas, like I said, India and other places where they may have had colonies around the world. Again, a lot of things even got affected around the world because of all the fly ash and the vaporized water going up too from a number of areas out. And again, some other people in other areas were affected because it was in the middle of the Pleistocene Ice Age, and that's why Lemuria, Atlantis, and Atlantis has to be where it's at, which is on the equator, so it's in a temperate climate.
Sure.
So a population of 20, 30, 40 million people can actually survive, not in some other areas which are a polar desert in other parts of the world at that time.
Once the ocean levels receded for Lemuria, and you could see the landmass, where is it today? I mean, what happened to it again? Something obviously happened.
Well, some of it, ends up being today in that area of Southeast Asia is underwater. And what I'm speaking about for Lemurian Atlantis and even Atlantis proper is that is an area of Indonesia and the surrounding area of Southeast Asia, which comprises also Malaysia and also even the Philippines might be the far northeastern extension, and also on the island of Borneo you have Kalimantan. You have also the Malaysia side,
So
which
there
is
are remnants of Lemuria out there, you think?
and Atlantis proper as well. So I mean, here's the thing with the two of them, they actually are really one and the same. What they did is Lemuria started off first and it got destroyed, and then was rebuilt to Atlantis proper, basically in the same location. And so there's three Atlantises in a sense. There's first the Lemuria Atlantis, which is the original, the motherland of civilization. Now there is a fatherland which is in this valley area, and that's considered maybe the second, depending on how you look at it, or the third. The third, or the second, depending on how you look at it, is the wondrous sun, where they rebuilt Atlantis proper. So usually, one way you can think is that, it's the father and the mother first, and then they have the offspring, the son. But that's one way. So you could label it, Lemurian Atlantis is the first one. The fatherland of civilization in this valley is the second one, the second Atlantis, and the third one is the wondrous sun. Or you could actually label it as Atlantis. Lemurian Atlantis is the original one, and basically the same spot. They rebuilt it again, so you could consider that the second one, and the third one would be the one over in fatherland over in India.
They just never gave up, did they?
Yeah, and it just depends which way you look at it, which is first and second and third. But the most important point is Lemurian Atlantis and Atlantis were in the same spot. It's just a matter it got destroyed and they had to rebuild.
What is so romantic about Lemuria, for example? Why is it so ingrained in mythology and legend? We just don't seem to let go of it.
Well, look, the thing is with Lemurian Atlantis it's the source of most all religions and most all science and most all races. It's where civilization began. And
was that the Garden of Eden?
And it is actually it is the birthplace of the Garden of Eden. I mean, it is where Garden of Eden actually is. That's what Professor Mauricio Santos found out, is that the Garden of Eden was the garden of Lemurian Atlantis, the original Atlantis. And so...
not modern day Iraq.
No, not Samaria, not Mesopotamia or anything like that.
Any remnants at all from Lemuria? Have they found artifacts, vases, anything?
There are different types of artifacts that are out there that have symbolic signs on them that they're, at least they have Atlantean type descriptions on them. Now, whether somebody painted these things up just recently based on the symbolism, there are some things that are out there, and we do have some, let's say drawings or photos or, etchings of those kind of artifacts. But what we're really after is to get the real original artifacts and really start excavating those. And we are working on that right now. We are starting to come up with some of those things.
John, the subject of Atlantis is one of the most fascinating subjects for our viewers. And you certainly have been a huge pioneer in bringing credibility to the idea that many of these ancient monuments around the world could be a lot older. But again, it's called the A word. People don't like the A word. Academics are terrified of it. Graham Hancock never wants to use the A word. So do you think that there was an Atlantis? Do you think Atlantis existed?
Even when I wrote Serpent in the Sky, which is more than 30 years ago, I was wise enough to put quotation marks around Atlantis. The quackademics forget about the quotation marks and accuse me of being an Atlantis freak. I think that there was not necessarily, put it this way, not necessarily a physical Atlantis in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a la Plato's account, but that there was a global civilization that went down under catastrophic circumstances, and there's now, the Atlantis part of it is not proved, but the cataclysm that brought down that global civilization is now verging on irrefutable evidence. And that's, Robert Schoch is doing a lot of work on that.
Well, you also wrote the foreword for Rand and Rose Flemath's revisited When the Sky Fell, which they retitled it.
Yeah, that's complicated because the Piri-Reis map is the Piri-Reis map, and there's Antarctica, but the geological cores, I forget what they call them, ice cores, sediment cores, according to Schoch, that should show that there was a crustal shift, don't show that. So that's now problematical. It doesn't destroy the validity of those very ancient maps, that somebody somewhere knew that the Americas were there and that Antarctica was there, but it's a somewhat different scenario now than when Rose and Rand wrote that particular book, which is long ago. I forget when it was, the early 80s or something like that.
But we do know with the Younger Dryas period that there was a sudden rise in sea level around the world.
No, that's the Younger Dryas brings in, this is double catastrophe. The Younger Dryas, Graham was talking about that yesterday at the symposium. The Younger Dryas sets off a deeper ice age. It's the ice age, and it goes a sharp drop in temperature. And then around the time that Plato gets very close, 9700 or so BC, there's a tremendous cataclysmic event, probably a Carrington event of immensely more magnitude. Schoch is doing a lot of work on this, that actually takes out Atlantis between quotes. I mean, it destroys almost in its entirety that global civilization.
What is a Carrington event?
They call them a CME now. It's a coronal mass ejection. It's a gigantic solar flare.
Oh.
And the Carrington event itself, that was 1859 or so, it destroyed the electrical grid at that time, which was just telegraph wires. So that was not a catastrophe. If we had even a Carrington event, which is a relatively minor CME, if we had one today, it would fry everything. We wouldn't be doing this interview. We probably wouldn't be here, or on the face of the planet, maybe.
So do you think that the destruction of Atlantis could be the result of a coronal mass ejection coming from the sun?
That's the best theory that we have to date. Robert Schoch's working on this, and it's based upon the very solid, un-woo-woo work of a plasma physicist named Anthony Perrott, who works at the for the Los Alamos, whatever it is, nuclear research center. And so the evidence is getting better and better for that. Like all of the evidence we've been talking about, it's complicated.
What do you think about the fact that this coronal mass ejection, this massive solar event, occurred exactly 1/2 of the precession of the equinoxes ago in actual years?
It might just be coincidence. As far as I know, the people who are studying the CMEs have not found a periodicity to it. It's not as though so far anyone can find that it happens every 12,000 years or every 36,000 years or anything like that. But that it does happen periodically, that seems to be well established. And Schoch is of the opinion, and it's an informed opinion, that we're sort of ready for one now. And if it happens, which doesn't mean, when he says that, it doesn't mean that it's tomorrow, and it doesn't even mean that it's next century, but somewhere in the centuries to come, the chances of one happening, he thinks, are pretty good.
Plato's Timaeus and Critias, of course, he mentions Atlantis in the books. But the conventional theory is, well, people who think that Atlantis existed, they're just basing it off of Plato. Do you believe that there's any other information besides Plato's original account that would support the idea of this global civilization?
Sure. I mean, there's our work, there's Schwaller's work, there's Laird Scranton's work, there's all the stuff that Graham has been working on. There's Gobekli Tepe that disappears, that they cover over deliberately. Now in Indonesia, there's Gunung Padang, which looks as though it's fantastically ancient. There's a ton of evidence out there, but the Plato myth itself is complicated. Most people, the Atlantis hunters, are always looking every month. Somebody says it's here, it's there, it's somewhere else. The Atlantis hunters are basically looking only at Plato. There's a very interesting book called The Pythagorean Plato by a musicologist and Sufi named Ernest G. McLean. I think he may still be alive. He'd be 10 years older or so than I am. That's old. In which he demonstrates pretty convincingly that as the story of Atlantis as told by Plato is actually a musical allegory designed to inform his musically initiated pupils of how harmony in music, representing the philosopher king, degenerates into tyranny by musical rules, actually. And initially, as I understand it, McLean didn't want to even hear about the Sphinx, which actually basically proves that there was an Atlantis within inverted quotes. And somewhere along the line, I understand, I never got in touch with him. Weird, his book came out about the same time as The Serpent. Now I'm about to rewrite, upgrade not The Serpent, but The Traveler's Key, which is my guidebook to Egypt. And that will incorporate McLean's work, because I think what it is that Plato actually gets the basic story of Atlantis, of cataclysm and destruction of civilization, from Solon, his grandfather, and then turns that into this musical allegory of how harmony becomes disharmony. So both are actually valid and are complementary rather than antithetical to each other.
Well, you mentioned something that's new and that most people don't know about, which is Gunung Padang. Could you sort of give us the basic 101 on that?
Well, it's a huge structure of immense basaltic blocks that in the middle of Indonesia somewhere. Schock has visited it now, and Hancock has spent some time there. And the blocks, so far, they haven't been able to see in them a coherent structure, because it may be unbelievably old, but this particular rock formation is normally found as vertical blocks, and here in Gunung Padang, it's a kind of scattered blocks that were at some point or another placed horizontally. They're not as they would be naturally, and they keep digging down, and they keep on finding this structure deep under the earth. So it's still at a beginning stage of excavation, and of course being battled by the quackademics in Indonesia. Quackademics are all over the world. It doesn't matter what race they're from. But there's a very brave Indonesian geologist who's gathering the forces to look deeper into Gunung Padang. So, yeah.
What is the dating saying in the dirt around these blocks as they keep digging down? How old is it?
I'm not that familiar with it, but judging from Graham's talk yesterday, they're down somewhere around 20,000 BC, and still finding that it's human, not human constructed, I'd say, but that it's
there's intelligence.
There's intelligence. Yeah, that's right. There's intelligence in the rocks. Yes, something like that.
You also mentioned the Valley Temple of the Sphinx.
Mm-hmm.
Could you cover that again? Just what? Talk about. Let's just review again the water weathering on the back of the Sphinx, and then the Valley Temple blocks.
Well, the water weathering is not so much the back of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is all of it has been weathered, but a lot of it has been restored. It's the enclosure wall behind the Sphinx and on the sides of the Sphinx. That's where the deepest weathering is, because that's where the water came sweeping down the plateau and over the walls, producing much deeper weathering than the Sphinx itself, which only would have been weathered by the rainfall falling directly upon it at some distant time when there was lots of rain. And the Valley Temple is right next door, and that's constructed of core masonry of huge, these are the ones, the blocks of stone that weigh 75, 100 tons, that were quarried out from the trench that they had to dig down in order to expose the core body of the Sphinx. It's like a cat sitting in a bathtub, or a very big cat sitting in a bathtub, and in order to get the cat so that its body is free from, call it the bath water, which happens to be stone, they have to quarry out all around that form. And this they did with not just, they didn't just chop it out, they quarried it out in these huge blocks, and those huge blocks went to build this remarkable Valley Temple, which then subsequently were faced with huge granite blocks, but it's the limestone blocks that the original, and even the academics acknowledge that those blocks come out of the trench that was excavated to produce the core body of the Sphinx, but they keep on insisting still to this day that it's all 2500 BC, but they won't be able to keep up this charade much longer because the evidence is piling up almost on a daily basis. And if they have any sense, they'll either acknowledge that, heaven forbid, they were wrong, or go down with the ship.
Mysterious and lost civilizations. Olaf, welcome to Beyond Belief.
Well, thanks for having me.
This is exciting work that you do. How'd you get involved in all of this?
Well, I research things, and one day I was doing some research and I came across a reference to something called the East Bay Wall. And the East Bay Wall is not far from where I live. I've lived in the Bay Area for most of my life, and I had never heard of it. And when I thought to myself, well, I've never heard of this. It seems to be a big deal. So I've got to figure out what it is. So I started to do research about it.
And you did a lot of research.
I did a lot of research. And some of it, there are things about it that are exciting, and there are things about it that bother me.
Now tell us a little bit about what this area is and what you were able to discover.
Sure. So the initial thing that I figured out was that there's a wall that runs roughly from San Jose to the Carquinez Straits. It's been reported on a few times, but not really.
Like the Great Wall of China, that kind of thing?
Well, it's kind of. In most places, it's about 3 to 4 feet high. It's about a foot across, and then we found out later it runs about 3 to 4 feet deep into the dirt. It's pretty old. And nobody knows where it came from. Conventionally, people think that an Amish farmer built it, that, I don't know, they can't figure out who built it. and the nature of that mystery is what attracted me to it. People had talked about it now and again, but I had never heard of it, so,
What kind of material?
It's loose rock. The rocks are about this big in size, and they're just basically stacked together into a wall.
And what are the dimensions?
In most places, it's about 3 to 4 feet high and about a foot across. But in some places, it can go up to 7 feet high. And we've discovered that it does indeed.
And how long?
The initial chunk was about 50 miles.
50 miles?
Yeah, it's broken in places.
What were they trying to keep out?
That's one of the big questions. One of the things that the whole wall thing excited me. I mean, I studied archaeology, I studied anthropology when I was in school. And so mysterious old things, I like that. But nobody had ever done any kind of archaeological research, and that bothered me. That we have this wall that nobody in the Bay Area has ever heard of. It's 50 miles long, which is ridiculous. And, it just sits there. Nobody knows why it was built. Nobody knows exactly who built it. Nobody knows exactly when built it because nobody ever dated it. I mean, it just sat there. Most people don't even know that it exists. The Native Americans in our area, around the Bay Area, they didn't build monumental structures. They didn't build structures out of stone or out of wood. They lived in small kind of movable houses, so to speak, and they were quasi-nomadic. So building a 50-mile long wall is kind of beyond what they would do.
Some believe that maybe the Spanish might have built this?
The Spanish, some people have talked about the Spanish. The problem is that when the Spanish arrived in our area, they actually reported the wall having already been there. So they couldn't have built it
So
because
it
they
couldn't have
found
been
it.
them.
No. See, this is where it gets mysterious, you know. Well, if the Native Americans didn't build it, the Spanish didn't build it, you know, who
Nobody
did?
takes claim.
Nobody takes claim to it, no. There is some weird, as you expand out from it, right, that you kind of jettison this notion that there's one wall.
Right.
Once you start to look in the entire environment of all of Northern California, then you start to understand more things about it. And there are more legends about the walls and about the structures that are associated with the walls. But the wall itself, yeah, no.
I was going to say, Olaf, is it possible that there are other things there that may be buried?
It is possible. As I said, no large-scale archaeological expedition has ever been carried out. Recently, I've been contacted by some people that are interested in possibly doing that, possibly using ground-penetrating radar to see if there's actually material below it.
Right, like we find at the pyramids, for example.
Yeah, I
they
mean,
realize there's structure there.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a wall and somebody built it, chances are they left garbage. I mean, as humans, one of the things we excel at is leaving garbage everywhere. So even in ancient times, they would leave shells, broken tools, little bits and pieces of stuff.
Bodies.
Bodies, right, sure. Hopefully there are no bodies.
Could the wall be older than people think? I mean, you can't carbon date it, unfortunately, but maybe there's things, like you just said, in the area that you might be able
Well,
to.
one of the things that's interesting that I've got a couple of rough dates on it, and one of the things that was interesting is that even without trying to date it, and yet you can't carbon date it, is that there are stretches of the wall where acorns fell out of trees, and the acorn opened, and the tree actually grew out of and bifurcated the wall, and now it's a huge tree. So the time it takes for that tree to grow gives you some idea of how old it is.
Right.
I was on a show, and they did attempt to date it. The date I got back, the conservative estimate is maybe 400 to 500 years, anywhere from 300 to 500 years old. The more liberal estimate is more than 700.
And there's a talk that there's other walls around?
Correct. So there's a wall that runs from San Jose to the Carquinez Strait. There's another wall that gets picked up and that goes across Marin out to Point Reyes and then goes north. So I started to follow these walls, and I came across some research done by some others, and it turns out there's a whole bunch of walls scattered all over Northern California.
Do you think, Olaf, there's some connection between all these walls?
I do. I think that it's a large-scale lost civilization. And one of the reasons being is that the walls are constructed in a very similar way. You have a mountain, and around the base of the mountain, that there's these spreading out in a circle are more walls. And the walls always go across the tops of ridge lines. And so in all these areas in Northern California where we have exceedingly high peaks like Shasta or the Buttes or even Mount Diablo, we have walls associated with them. Like Shasta has walls around it. Mount Diablo has walls around it. So there's a kind of structure to it that seems to be consistent. It also stops at Fresno. It doesn't go any further south than Fresno. And as it goes in the extreme northern part of the state, they're more concentrated. And as you go south, they become more diffuse. So it looks like it was concentrated in the northern part of the state and along the coast.
Maybe they had a bullet train from LA to San Francisco.
You know, I wish
and this was the path. Huh?
I wish we could find that bullet train and make my life easier.
What does your gut tell you in terms of the civilization involved and the purpose of a wall? I mean, because, you know, as far as I'm concerned, a wall is to keep something out or in.
Right. One of the things that I find interesting is that in doing the research, I did a lot of research into the Yurok. And the Yurok are a Native American group that live in the northern part of the state. They actually have a legend of what's called the Wagas. And the Wagas were a light-skinned people that came to the Yurok centuries. I mean, they talked about it being, 10,000 years ago, something like that. That's probably too much, but many thousands of years ago, these people came to them and taught them things and tried to help them to learn how to fish, to learn how to grow, to learn how to build things. And one day, these people left. And they went back up into the mountains where they had come from and up into the north where they had come down from. And they said, we'll be back someday. Now, unfortunately for the Yurok, when European settlers came, they thought it was the Wagos, which didn't turn out too well. But this kind of notion that there was a pre-existing group there that came down out of the mountains and from the north and taught them things, and then decided they wanted to leave, disappeared up into the mountains and to the north. Well, that's where we find this stuff. We find this stuff in mountains and to the north. So that seems to be consistent. What's odd is that they're light-skinned, kind of Anglified people. And that's strange because there shouldn't be any there at that time.
But where'd they go?
Nobody knows. They disappeared. They built structures on top of the mountains in the area. They told the Yurok to look after these structures, that one day they would come back. They left behind one person who is a half Yurok, half Wagos, to care for their deer because they thought that the deer were kind of like their pets. And they had a whole fairly sophisticated trough system set up to feed deer and all this. And eventually he got tired of waiting, and he told the people that were helping him, the Yurok, I'm going to leave now. I'm going to go back to be with them. So he disappeared. He walked off into the forest going north and was gone.
Far out theory, extraterrestrials?
I think at this point, anything's game. I think that it's not the theory that I would gravitate toward, but in the absence of any evidence at all, I think it's worthwhile. There are things out there that do defy explanation, and I think that as researchers, that's one of the things that disturb me, is that archaeologists have never looked at it. As researchers, you have to have an open mind. You have to look at all the possibilities and then figure out what the right one is.
Why haven't these archaeologists jumped in there?
I think a lot of it has to do with funding. They go after things that get them funding.
And make money.
The world is turned by money, and I think that archaeology is run that way as well.
There's always been talk of giants around Catalina Island. And what about this area? Wasn't there some kind of discovery with bones or something like that?
Yeah, there was actually. In Concord, California, which is probably maybe 20 miles away from the wall, they found an 8-foot-tall giant, a burial site of an 8-foot-tall giant. And the Smithsonian, usual story, you've heard this before.
Yes, I have.
Smithsonian comes in, they date it, they say it's really old, it's strange, it has a lot of weird grave goods around it. Then they take it, it's gone, can't find any record of it.
Where do they put these things?
Probably in a vault somewhere.
Down in the basement in Washington,
Down in the
DC,
third sub-basement, I would imagine.
Exciting stuff. How do you compare it to the stories of Lemuria?
Well, I think, if I had to look at one explanation, I think that Lemuria is probably the most logical. Because one of the things that you see is that Lemuria, in case the listeners don't know, it's a kind of parallel to Atlantis, that Lemuria exists in the Pacific. Atlantis is in the Atlantic. And Lemuria died in a catastrophic event.
Was it an island nation?
It was an island nation. And they had connections out through everywhere. And one of the persistent stories is that when Lemuria was destroyed, however it was destroyed, that the survivors came to California. And that's why we see a lot of weird things here. The Catalina, even in the Mojave Desert, Shasta was supposedly, many people, the Rosicrucians, for example, believe that Lemurians live in Mount Shasta. So, in California, we took the survivors, so to speak. But they also went down into South America, they went down into Central America, and they went up, into Oregon and Washington.
Exactly where in the Pacific might it have been?
It's hard to say. Some people have put it in the Indian Ocean, which I think is a little too far, but supposedly it was pretty close to the center of the Pacific Ocean.
What is the magma bowl?
The magma bowl is very interesting, and it's actually one of the reasons why I believe in things like Lemuria. The magma bowl is a bowl that's completely covered in cuneiform, Babylonian cuneiform. So we're talking Iraq, the Middle East, right? So this bowl was discovered in a place called Pumapunku, which is in the Altiplano in Bolivia. And nobody can explain how a bowl that's dedicated to Ishtar and was given to virgins of the Ishtar cult ended up in Bolivia.
Just popped up?
Apparently it just popped up. Now what makes more sense is that if you have something, it had to get there somehow. So somebody either had to sail across the Pacific from the Middle East with this bowl. And there's an accompanying statue as well. There's not just a bowl, there's a statue. Also completely covered in cuneiform. And it can be translated. It has been translated. Now, if you've got this bowl and this statue, it gets there somehow. Either somebody crossed the Pacific Ocean with this thing, or more likely they went somewhere and then, you know, maybe they picked it up as a tourist item or they traded for it, whatever. They end up with it on a central location, and then that same person says, well, I'm going to go over here, and that happens to be Bolivia in the Altiplano.
This entire case, in terms of your involvement and the puzzlement of what it might be,
right?
What does it tell you? What's the central theme of what might be going on here?
That our region of the world, the West Coast, is a lot older and a lot more visited than we think.
Than we thought.
You know,
it wasn't just Christopher Columbus, was it?
No. I mean, the Chinese came. You know, there's good evidence the Chinese came. There's evidence that other people came even, you know, older than that. You've got this mysterious lost civilization that exists. You know, you've got Babylonian bowls appearing in Bolivia. You've got other Middle Eastern items that have shown up along the central and South
Egyptian hieroglyphs,
Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Grand Canyon. Supposedly there's an Egyptian burial site in the Grand Canyon. This seems to indicate that movement, kind of pre-Columbian movement, was a lot more sophisticated than what we were taught in school.
I agree. Yeah. Put the mindset of an ancient explorer. You're looking out over an ocean.
Right.
One, thinking you fall off at the end.
Right.
What would possess them, Olaf, to get in a boat and just keep sailing? I mean, at some point, because of the vastness of the ocean, they had to give up and say, what are we doing? This is ridiculous. I mean, one, they didn't know that there was land in North America or Central America or South America. They didn't know that just by appearance. It was trial and error, I would assume, right?
I think the central theme there, if you want to put yourself in that position, is that these guys were adventurers. That, you know, when Columbus did sail across, that his crew became very concerned that they were going to fall off the edge of the world. Yeah. The Vikings were the same way. As the Vikings were sailing across the North Atlantic toward Greenland and Iceland, you know, they thought that they were going to die and never make it back. What pushes them forward? I think it's the adventure of it, the conquest of it. You know, it's the same reason that we go into space. It's the same reason that we go down deep into the ocean. We've got to see what's there. And conventional thought being I'm going to fall off the edge of the world, I don't think that will work for 80% of the people in the world, but there's always 10% or 20% of the people. That's not good enough. That they literally have to fall off the edge of the world. That they're not going to believe that the fire is hot until they touch it. They're not going to believe that they're going to get electrocuted by an electric fence until they hold it. They have to actually do it.
What perseverance, though, to keep pushing and going. I mean, I got to tell you, if I were a sailor on a ship, traveling through the ocean, seeing no landmass.
It's scary.
And we're talking, what, months?
Months. It's scary.
Yeah, you might say maybe we should go back.
Thor Heyerdahl is a great example. Thor Heyerdahl was an anthropologist. He wanted to prove that the Egyptians could have sailed across the ocean.
Yes.
So he created Ra.
Right.
And the first Ra sank. But he was daring enough to say, I want to prove that this could work. So he built a reed ship and he attempted to sail across the ocean. The second time he made it. Then after that, he said, well, you know what? Now I want to prove that the Polynesians could have sailed
in Kon-Tiki.
Right? What drove him to do it? It was the daringness, the adventure of attempting to try to prove that it was real. And the fearlessness of that. And it takes those kind of fearless people, you know, to go into space, to go deep into the ocean, to try to go through the rainforest, to find lost civilizations. You know, we have to have the
drive
and the heroicness to do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that that's lost today, that we step back too far and we send probes out into the space to see the rings of Saturn. And, really, I think as humans, we need to go see that ourselves.
No doubt. We're with Olaf Phillips, of course, conspiracy researcher. And when they say conspiracy researcher, what do they mean by that?
Well, I like to do research, and a lot of times I end up doing research about conspiracies. So, the thing about it is that much like the wall and much like those kinds of ancient
You like adventure, don't you?
I like adventure and I like puzzles. And these things are all puzzles. Who built that wall? Why? Who? I don't know. I mean, well, the conspiracies, there's a lot. Pick one. But, who did it? Why? What was the motivation? Everybody has a motivation for what they do. What was their motivation in doing this thing?
What is your favorite conspiracy, Olaf?
I like the secret space program. And I like
Really?
And I like ancient mysteries. Yeah.
Do you think there is a secret space program?
Absolutely.
It's been going on for a long time.
Very long time.
Do we have bases on the moon, on the other side, the far side of the moon?
I think so.
A lot of people think that.
I think that there are bases on Venus and on Mars and on the moon.
What makes you say that?
Well, the Venus thing is different, but on Mars, even aside from the face on Mars and the tholus and the pyramid and all that, if you look at it, you can actually find the buildings. They're there. You can't hide this.
Strange structures.
Strange structures that were built by human beings. And they're there. You just have to look. On the moon, if you look enough, you can see the tracks of the vehicles. The stuff's there. You just have to look.
Astronauts didn't go to.
No,
something else.
Yeah, it's all there. You just have to look for it. And I think, much like the wall, one of the things that happens is that as humans we become complacent. That we get up and we go to work and we come home from work and we don't really try to understand things beyond our immediate scope. And so, these things are staring you right in the face, but you don't see it because you don't want to see it, or you're not putting yourself in a position to see it. So,
what if we had advanced ancient civilizations that had capability? We see, for example, in the old Sanskrits of India, flying machines, Vimanas, they were everywhere. What if we had the capability of going to the moon with an advanced civilization that somehow got blown up or something happened to them hundreds of millions of years ago? Is it conceivable that when you talk about a secret space program, we may also be talking about planetary visitations, going to the moon with these ancients from a long, long time ago?
Yes, and I think things like this, what we were talking about before, I think they play into it. That, you look at some of these structures that are built, very sophisticated. And you look at the Vedas and the ancient Sanskrit and the Vimanas and all that, and they talk about very sophisticated things. I think it's completely conceivable that happened. Roughly 15,000 years ago, supposedly there was a battle between two cities, Mohenjo and Harappa in India. And they fought it out in a huge cataclysmic war.
Nukes.
Yeah. Though I would argue they use kinetic energy weapons, but there are two different schools of thought on that.
But they might have been even more advanced than we thought.
Even more advanced. Yeah. And at the same time, around 15,000 years ago, you have this Black Knight satellite that shows up.
Yeah.
At the same time. Now, conventionally, the Black Knight, for example, people believe that it was actually like a probe. But what if it wasn't? What if it actually came from Harappa or Mohenjo? What if it actually was a weapons platform, or if it was a ship that they had built?
It's supposed to still be up there.
It is up there, yeah.
You do great research, Olaf, and for people who want to track what you do, how do they find you?
Anomalies.net.
That's it, anomalies.net. Olaf, thanks for being on Beyond Belief.
Thank you very much.
Just fascinating, just to imagine that past civilizations might have built structures and walls or been to the moon. It just makes you think, doesn't it? I'm George Norrie, and thanks for watching Beyond Belief.